Through last summer and fall, a state task force met to review laws and practices on the use of deadly force in community policing. You're a law enforcement officer who served on that task force. Can you tell us about those meetings?
You bet. This task force came from a bill that we introduced last year that passed through our caucus and the Senate caucus with a great deal of bipartisan support. And it was the product of a bill that had been heard before and didn't pass that would have adjusted the deadly use of force statute and taken away the protections from our law enforcement officers. When this bill came forward, it got my support because it was a means of bringing our communities and our law enforcement officers together to meet, exchange notes, and come to some common ground and really kind of become acquainted with each other to see where we can go with building trust within our community. So I was very happy to support that bill, just to have that good conversation, you know. But unfortunately, when the task force started meeting, and really at the very first meeting, it became pretty apparent to me that the two sides of these issues were pretty solidified in their corners and probably really not willing to come forward. While I believe that we did find some common ground on with some of these recommendations that came out of the task force, it became pretty clear to me early on that the communities that were represented on this task force had just one plan in mind, and that was to adjust the statute that's in place that protects our law enforcement officers from prosecution when they simply make a mistake, making a split-second decision at work that ends up costing a life, unfortunately. Now, and our law enforcement officers get put under a great deal of stress in situations like this and have to make very quick decisions. So protections like the ones that we have in the law now are necessary. So that's my goal in moving forward, is to continue to have those protections for our law enforcement officers.
What kind of change to the law did the task force recommend to the legislature?
So the bill that was introduced, very first bill out of the chute this year, House Bill 1000, was presented to the legislature essentially by the communities. What this bill does, as part of the bill, it would remove the term malice and the term good faith from the statute that protects law enforcement officers in deadly use of force situations, called the Justifiable Homicide Statute in Revised Code of Washington. And those are the protections that I'm talking about that our law enforcement officers need in these critical situations to protect them when sometimes, unfortunately, they just make a simple mistake and don't have any evil intent. But oftentimes things are just different than what the officer might perceive. Sometimes they're just mistakes made, and we need to have protections in place for our law enforcement officers. That bill also has many other recommendations in it, but I felt that it was very one-sided. That bill's not going to be moving forward.
So the recommendations that came from the task force, you also opposed. Why?
There were some other recommendations there that came from the communities that were represented on the task force that I just felt to be very one-sided. They didn't take into account the law enforcement side of it and the things that I believe are really necessary to bring communities together. The one charge that we had in this task force was to make recommendations that will reduce the number of fatal interactions between law enforcement officers and members of the community. And I simply don't believe that adjusting the statute will do that, and will reduce that number. And frankly, I think it becomes a wedge between law enforcement officers and those communities that need the law enforcement protections the most. So that's why I opposed that recommendation in particular. There were definitely other recommendations within the task force that I do support. We need to work on our data collection, so we have some data to depend on. So if we go to make changes in the future, we have that data to work with. Right now, we don't officially have that data. So we need to work on a few other things. I think we need to work on some training. We need to work on some good, consistent funding for our law enforcement officers training in the Criminal Justice Training Center, and that's largely agreed upon.
What's happening in the legislature right now on this issue?
So there will be another bill forthcoming. I understand it's in draft form right now. It hasn't been pushed forward. I have actually seen that draft, but it still removes the term malice and adjusts the definition of good faith. And this is being seen by many as being middle ground. I'm still very concerned about making the change to the statute that people think is going to be some sort of panacea to fixing a relationship that is going to take a heck of a lot more than that to mend. We need good, strong, proactive community policing out there. And we need to continue to build relationships and have programs in place in our individual jurisdictions that build that sense of community and reject this sense of nationalizing our police forces that's being pushed down from the federal level. We do not need one-size-fits-all policing in Washington State by any means. Individual communities need to be able to come forward and encourage their law enforcement officers to do what's right for that individual community.